Hello, good afternoon. I'm hoping everybody is hearing me and seeing me perfectly. I'm really excited. My name is Yasmin, and I'm super happy to be part of this amazing initiative on promoting tolerance in our schools, our classrooms, community throughout, families. And I'm really happy to be able to introduce Barry Lee Cummings. He is a lecturer, speaker, trainer, a digital strategist, which I'm nothing close to being. And today he is going to be speaking about how to promote tolerance um, and in the classrooms and to keep like cyberbullying away and really, really important things that I think sometimes are overlooked. So I am going to pass the mic to Barry. Thank you so much for being with
Thank,
us.
thank you, Yasmin. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let me know with a thumbs up that you can see something on the screen. Good, good, excellent. So again, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real honor to be part of this in terms of this event and this week to really help talk about a subject that's very close to my heart when it comes to bullying and how we can help prevent this, how we can do some things as parents, as teachers, as caregivers, anybody that has a young person that they care for. The information that I'd like to share today is around that space. It focuses on cyberbullying, but it also goes beyond cyberbullying as well into some of the other things that we need to be aware of as parents, caregivers, and teachers, so that we can understand a little bit more about the world our children are growing up in, a little bit more about why they do the things that they do when it comes to the digital platforms, and how we can hopefully be a little bit more prepared and educated and aware so that we can be helpful to them. And so today's session is going to be a session that takes us from bullying through bullying to tolerance and diversity. And I would like to share some things with you, some issues, some topic, and then more importantly, focus on some positivity in terms of people that have experienced negative things in the online space, but have come through that, how they've come through that, what they're doing now, and how those are the kind of things that we want to promote to our children so that they can see lots of examples of how things can be done in the online space. Because bullying, whether it's cyber or offline, is unacceptable in my book. But we also have to be aware that in some cases, those that are doing the bullying are as much a victim as those that are being bullied. And we have to get into the mindset of our children to understand how this goes. So I'll just do a little brief introduction just to top up in terms of what Yasmin had said there. My main job is a digital marketing agency. It's how I have the knowledge to be able to deliver some of these sessions when it comes to Beat the Cyberbully. Beat the Cyberbully became a reality in 2014 because of the conversations I was having with businesses. But when you take away the titles such as general manager, marketing director, a lot of the time you're left with mum and dad. And after about 5 minutes of talking about how YouTube algorithm works and certain things like that, a lot of the questions started moving away from business and more to, but hang on, if that's how YouTube works, does that mean that my child can see this? And then we would talk at length about this. And so this is where Beat the Cyberbully has come from. Taking all that knowledge, I work with Google, I work with Facebook, I work with YouTube, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, all the places that our children spend a lot of time. And I've taken that knowledge and turned it hopefully into bite-sized chunks that we can understand as mum and dad, to help us become more informed and more aware when it comes to the digital space. Because we as mum and dad have a hard task ahead of us, because as technology changes, as it moves, our children are moving at 100 miles an hour forwards. And some of us as mum and dad, we are stationary. And so if we are stationary and they're moving at 100 miles an hour, they're getting further and further away from us when it comes to their knowledge of how to use these platforms and our knowledge. And this is how they get into trouble through things like cyberbullying and some of the other things that we will talk about today. So I live and breathe the digital. I'm a very proactive ambassador for all the digital platforms. When I go into schools and I talk to students, I make it very clear from the beginning that I'm not there to tell them stop using it, this is a bad thing. I want to help empower them to use it as safely as possible, to be able to identify when they may be getting drawn into something like cyberbullying, or whether they're getting drawn into some of the other negative scenarios that are being undertaken in the online space far too often today. So today's session, I would like to talk a little bit about those threats. Bullying is the core focus of this, but I want to go beyond bullying and into some of the other areas, touch on what we can do as parents and caregivers, and how we can empower our children by being aware ourselves. And then really a core focus on from bullying to thriving, and how some of the examples that we've been through, some personal experience as well from me, in terms of how to utilize those and turn it around so that we get to this idea of a more tolerant society based on our knowledge of what's going on, and it becomes a more inclusive society based on what we understand of what's going on in the digital space. And I think that that's a really important message throughout this week, I know, for this event, and I'd like to do my bit to contribute to that. And then we'll just have a little bit at the end about continued education for those that are tuned in, listening, and would like to carry on learning. And we have some options there as well. And I feel that it's something that we should. I'm constantly learning about this, and by no means do I know everything about the digital space. No chance, nobody does. I know a little bit more perhaps than some people, and I would like to share that knowledge with the audience today. So to start, we have a common goal, whoever we are, whether we are a parent, whether we're an auntie and uncle, whether we're a teacher, we have a common goal when it comes to our children, and it's to prepare them for what is unfortunately now, towards the end of 2021, almost inevitable, that our children are going to experience negative things online, things like cyberbullying and other online threats that we're going to talk about. There's no getting away from it anymore. The last 18 months to 2 years of COVID has meant that our children have been forced to go online even more for their education, for their socializing, for pretty much everything to do with their lives. And so our conversation has to move on from screen time management and so forth. They're online, they're on screens. We have to accept that. We have to stop pushing back against that, because that's going to happen. We can still put some things in place to balance just how much time they're spending on a screen. But the reality for many of our children now, even from the youngest age, is that they are looking at a screen, and by being on those screens, they are exposed to certain things. So we as parents need to have the ability to prepare them for what is coming ahead of them, regardless of their age. And the next thing that we want to do as a common goal is we want to empower them. We want to empower our children to be able to evaluate the situations that they are seeing in the online space, to process what's going on and see certain things, and then, of course, be able to overcome some of those negative situations themselves, because it's not like we can just wrap them in cotton wool and do that for their whole life. We also have to build resilience with them and help them to understand a little bit about the world. And the way I frame that is that before the internet, we had the situations that would unfold in the offline space, and we call it street smarts. Okay, so people will probably understand this, is that depending on where you lived and where you grew up, you started to understand where threats were when you were walking down the street, when you were going to school, when you were at the playground. You started to see situations and say, you know what, I can see this is not something that I want to be involved with. I'm going to avoid it. And this is exactly what we need to instill in our children today, so that they have the equivalent of street smarts to see situations happening in the online space where they may be in danger, where they may be putting themselves in danger's way, and able to overcome those. Because, as I said just there, it's inevitable that there's going to be negative things exposed to our children, whether we like it or not. There are a number of specific risks to our children and young people, which is what CYP stands for. On the screen, you can see a list of just a few of the things that our children, whether we like it or not, need to be aware of when it comes to what they're doing in the online space, because there are risks to their reputation. So for their future, for our children, things like sharing images that are inappropriate, images of a sexual nature. And unfortunately, this is a problem that is not just over in the US or the UK or Australia. It's a problem that we are facing here in the UAE. I know this because of the conversations that I've had with some of the young people after I've delivered my sessions in schools, where they're telling me exactly how they've done these kind of things, and they've got themselves into a situation where they don't know what to do. Should they tell their parents? Should they tell the school? What do I do? And as a young person, they're not entirely sure how to deal with that. Cyberbullying is, of course, a huge issue, and bullying overall, cyber or otherwise, whereby our children are being exposed to this in the online space just by being online, by being in a group chat, by being on a social media platform, that cyberbullying is happening. And it is a real risk to our children. It's one that we can hopefully equip them to be able to understand and avoid. Over the last few years, the last 2 years, 18 months, cyber scams and crime have gone through the roof and have been targeted at our children. Because they've been spending so much time online, those predators out there know that, and they are sending through things like malware and scam links on WhatsApp chats, through the gaming platforms, through the instant chat on a lot of these platforms where young people are playing online games. They're so engrossed in the game, they're not really thinking. They see a message comes up, and it's an offer that's too good to be true for the game that they're playing, ways to upgrade their weapons, their armor, their level ups, and so forth. And so without even 2 seconds thought, they click on that link. And that also exposes them to sometimes malware being installed on their devices, and those devices then either being destroyed or being monitored. And then things like passwords are able to be gleaned from those. So these are things that we need to be aware of, so that we can talk to our children about these things. Again, it's not a subject that we want to talk about at length, but unfortunately, it's one that we need to be able to recognize and acknowledge, and that there is an issue, especially for young men globally, and that's the access to pornography. In spite of the best efforts from a lot of the telecommunications and so forth to protect and prevent those from being accessed, they're finding ways to it. Fake profiles and grooming, these are two that I'm going to come back to. These are risks that our children need to be aware of, and that we need to be aware of. Online abuse in line with cyberbullying, peer abuse, because when it comes to cyberbullying, most cyberbullying scenarios that take place are between children that know each other. It's not strangers that are cyberbullying them. It's actually children they know. It's their so-called, air quotes, friends or other people at their school or in their year group. And that's where cyberbullying tends to unfold. So this idea of peer abuse is something that needs to be made aware to our children, that sometimes the people that we know at school, they go online, they set up fake profiles, they pretend to be something or be somebody, and then end up cyberbullying them. Extortion is going to be linked to the grooming subject in a minute. And then things like identity theft, when our children are so comfortable with putting so much information in the online space about themselves, they effectively paint a target on their back when it comes to predators, to say, well, that young person has put so much information out there about them through Snapchat or TikTok. I know them. I know what they like. I know where they are. I know where they're going. I know who they spend time with. And it makes it easier for them to then infiltrate their network of friends, either steal their identity or get into things like grooming. And I want to talk about grooming because it's, again, an uncomfortable subject, but we need to be aware of it because it's a very real danger when it comes to things like online misuse and bullying. Grooming is the action where a predator decides to speak to your child, but pretends to also be a child, for example. So your 10-year-old is on TikTok and they get contacted through TikTok direct messages by someone else who also says they're a 10-year-old, and they start to share information, and it feels like they're friends, and they are sharing all sorts of information, sharing different things. But over a period of time, and this can be quite quick, but it can also take a number of weeks or months, that child starts to trust this new friend that they've made in the online space, start to trust them with information, starts to trust them with secrets that they don't want to tell anyone else because they're their friend. And this whole action in terms of what's happening is called grooming, that the predator is grooming that young person with a view to then actively taking them on a journey to get them to do something that they don't really want to do. The end result from that can be extortion, so that they are groomed to a point where they agree to send inappropriate images to that predator. And as soon as that first image is sent, then the demands for money come in terms of, if you don't send me 1,000 dirhams, I'm going to share this with your family. If you don't send me 5,000 dirhams, I'm going to share this with your school. If you don't send me more of these kind of content, I will share everything within your community and embarrass you that way when it comes to the kind of abuse. So they set up fake profiles, they groom, and then they unfortunately target young people. Something again that unfortunately over the COVID period we have seen increase. This isn't UAE specific, but in Ireland, where my business partner is, between April 2020 and March 2021, grooming offences are up by 139% on the same period the previous year. And so this is a very real risk we need to be aware of, that we need to talk to our children about, because they're spending time on there. 78% of those increased offences were against girls, and the youngest victim was only 5 years old. So for those of us that think, well, our children are too young, we have a lot of young children using the internet online, have iPads, have smartphones, and there is an inherent risk there if we are not aware of what is happening. So the fact that we are spending more time online, the predatory nature of those out there that would look to exploit that, they know this and they are utilizing it against us and our children when it comes to cyberbullying and all of the other risks that I've just outlined there. As I said at the beginning, this session is going beyond bullying, because I feel that we need to be aware of some of these things for our children's sake and for their safety, to be better able to protect them and guide them when it comes to the digital space. The last one on there is the dark web. I've put it on there as a specific risk. It deserves its own sessions, but I want people to be aware of it. If you haven't heard of the dark web, then we need to be aware of it, because I've spoken to 12 and 13-year-olds in a variety of schools in the UAE who know what the dark web is. They know how to access the dark web, and they are active in that space. As a brief overview, the dark web is somewhere that is not monitored. It is not like Google or TikTok or any of these other platforms where there is a reporting function. And on the dark web, you can pretty much do whatever you like, and you can purchase things. You can purchase the latest iPhones, you can purchase gaming systems, you can purchase new laptops, you can purchase drugs, you can purchase bombs, you can purchase the necessary ingredients to create your own bomb along with the recipe for that, and you can purchase people on the dark web. And all of this happens with cryptocurrency, so there's no tracking in place, and it's just not a very savory place for a 12, 13-year-old to be spending any time when they're not really fully aware of what's going on. So the online space that we recognize as where our children spend time, the Googles and the Epic Games, the PUBG and the Fortnite, the Snapchat, the TikTok, that's a very, very small part of the internet. That's about 30% of what goes on online. The other 70% happens in the dark web. And as I said, there are a lot of tweens and teenagers that know how to access the dark web and are spending a little bit of time in there. We need to be aware of that as parents, so that we can talk to them and educate them about the inherent dangers there, so that they don't get into situations where they can really get into harm's way from that side of things. I just want to show a quick video just to really emphasize that. This is a video that I want to show to parents and teachers, because I show it to the children and the students when I speak to them. I think it's really important in terms of how the video visually depicts the life of a young person right now, and how that can sometimes end not the way they thought it would end. So that one, I think if you've seen it before, if not, it depicts the speed at which our children are doing things online and how they get themselves into certain situations. And as I said before, it actively demonstrates how grooming happens. When I talk to students in school and to your children at schools, I tell them to be in no denial that grooming and extortion are a multi-billion-dollar business around the world. It is people's jobs to try and identify young people to get into these situations with the view to eventually extorting money from them. So it's also something very important for us to be able to be aware of. Now, having identified some of those kind of risks and those pain points for our children in the online space, I want to talk to us, to parents and caregivers, about how we can approach this and how we need to maybe approach things slightly differently, because depending on how old we are and what generation we fall into actually really impacts how we can help our children overcome things like bullying, how we can help them to be understanding of what tolerance actually is, and how inclusivity and diversity are so important in our lives moving forwards. But how we frame that is really important, because in some cases we're talking literally a different language to our children. And of course, when we're not talking the language, they turn off. Now, why is this really important? Well, the first thing that we need to be aware of when we're thinking about talking to our children about getting through things like bullying is to be very, very aware of where they are physiologically in terms of their development. And again, I'm going to go quite quickly because there's a lot of content to come through, but we need to understand that when we're talking to our 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, the area of their brain that works out planning and reasoning and whether this is a good idea or not is not developed. The prefrontal cortex, it doesn't develop fully until we're 25 years old as human beings. So when we are telling our teens and preteens about certain things and trying to get them to understand the potential dangers, they're not listening because they don't really care, because their brain is not physiologically developed enough to understand that. They also have less of they're more impulsive when it comes to risk. The amygdala is not developed, and so they don't really listen when we say, you know what, this is dangerous, this could hurt you. Their idea of risk is very, very different. So again, if we're aware of that when we are talking to them, we can maybe start to pre-frame how we're talking to them, the language that we're utilizing, and maybe be able to start to talk a language that they understand. Why is this so important? Well, because again, depending on our age, we fall into these different generations, and our relationship with technology is very different depending on where we fall in this table. And therefore, how we talk about and utilize technology is very different. So those that fall into the baby boomers category in terms of birth year, then the technology has been acquired, and we have a very different world back then. If you were born between 1946 and 64, in terms of how we approach things: workaholic, idealistic, competitive, value titles, and the corner office. This was something to aim for. Technology was acquired. It was there and it was acquired. It wasn't really a core part of life. Generation X from 65 to 76 were assimilated with the technology, more of a self-reliance, adaptable, cynical, and to a certain extent tech savvy. Then we have this little group called Zennials, 77 to 83, and I fall into this one. Very, very similar to Generation X, but just with a slightly different approach, in that when I was younger, I didn't grow up with social media when I was a child, but as I started to enter university years, that's when technology, mobile phones and social media and the internet were really taking off. And so again, I have an assimilated view of that technology. The millennials, they have an integral relationship with technology, and they are often described as entitled, optimistic, civic-minded, confrontational, and impatient. And then we've got Generation Z, the 1997 to 2012, the so-called digital natives. Some of our children fall into this area, the ones that are really struggling with the digital space, with bullying, with being intolerant of other people, with not really looking at inclusion. And they're looking for the answers to those questions, the search for truth. They value individual expression. They want people to be able to talk about whatever they want. They want them to be independent. But they're also the first generation that is having to deal with this transition from analog to digital, with how to utilize the technology, how to use social media. And they're also the first generation of teens and tweens trying to understand why their parents are doing certain things a certain way and trying to prevent them from doing things. So these are very important to understand. Myself, whilst I am a Zennial, I also have two children that fall into the latest generation, which is Generation Alpha. And the Generation Alpha are those people, those kids born from 2010 onwards. What's going to happen with them is obviously yet to be revealed because they're still going through a lot of this, the process. And what is evident is that they will be the largest generation by 2025 in the history of the world. They will also be the first generation to be completely immersed in technology from birth through to death. And they will be the most educated generation of all time. They will have a very different relationship with technology. And some of the research is now showing that they will bend the technology to their will, whereas Generation Z right now, the technology is bending them, and it's all about the addiction to it and how they're not able to control it and how we as parents are not able to guide them because we don't know what's going on. So there's light at the end of the tunnel is why I include that. Generation Alpha are going to change all of this, and a lot of the problems that we're experiencing right now with things like cyberbullying and online misuse, Generation Alpha won't face because they will have overcome those. Generation Z is the guinea pig generation that's going to go through this and help Generation Alpha be able to come out the other side. So let's focus a little bit on Generation Z because that's where we have to do the most work, if you like. They are the current youth of society. They have diverse ethnicities. They're looking at economic obstacles and sexual orientation very differently because of what they're exposed to in the online space. They get so much information so quickly that they are having a very different relationship with the technology itself, with the content that they're seeing, but most importantly, with things like mental health. Generation Z are what are described as the lonely generation. They are connected with a smart device and a tablet and everything. They're online and connected that way, but they also are the first to describe themselves as lonely, as not connected, as feeling alone, as having anxiety and depression. And again, for some of us, we think, well, what on earth could a 10-year-old be anxious about? What on earth could a 12-year-old have depression about? But if you think back to the physiological changes of a 12, 13-year-old going on, their body's changing, everything's changing. And then you add on top of this the digital layer that they're having to deal with right now with social media, unrealistic expectations that they are looking to achieve through influencers and so-called famous people online. The rise of mental illness is a really, really big problem that we need to be aware of as mum and dad so that we can spot some of the signs that there may be a problem with our children. Again, not a comfortable topic, but things like suicide need to be talked about because there are more and more young people believing that this is the answer to the situation that they're facing online, that there is so much bullying happening. They are being bullied incessantly through all of the technology that they're utilizing. It's not stopping because unlike when I was at school, if there was bullying happening at school, when school ended and I went home, at least there was a break, there was respite. Whilst I was at home and in my room, I was safe. But for our children today, that's not the case because that smart device comes with them and it's there in their room, in their house, and the bullying is continual and they are not able to deal with it because their brain, again, is not physiologically developed enough to come up with a solution to this problem. And this is why we've started to see the really sad statistics of suicide going up. I had another slide that I was taking now, but it's unfortunately it's the second largest taker of lives of 15 to 24-year-olds. And it's second only to accidental death. So the reason why I'm doing these sessions, why Beat the Cyberbully exists, is because that is an unacceptable scenario to happen, that a 12-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old gets to the point of deciding that there's nothing that they should be here for. And this is all around education and awareness, because if we can start to change the narrative, we can make a big difference on a lot of Generation Z and millennials' lives, and we can help Generation Alpha move forwards faster and actually leverage the technology at their disposal. So what can we do as parents? There are some very hands-on things that I want to share with you. The first thing that we can do is we can think about our own usage. How many of us are on our phones all of the time? How many of us say and do things in the online space that perhaps we wouldn't do face-to-face? And our children see this and they absorb it because they're sponges and they copy. So we have to think about how we use our technology. If we've got our phone in our hand all of the time, are you really surprised that your 13, 14-year-old or your 8-year-old also wants to have their phone in the hand all of the time? Think about how we use the technology, model appropriate behavior so that our children see us doing it. It's not just us telling them and they then copy that. A great one, especially that is a really easy one to start with, is that instead of anybody taking a mobile device to their room, when it comes to bedtime, charging station downstairs in the kitchen, in the living room or the landing, all our mobile devices go on there, charge overnight, and at a specified time in the morning, we get them back. So think about modeling appropriate usage of the technology. We can also look to cultivate and maintain open lines of communication. This is core. This is really, really important. We have to start talking with our children in a language that they can recognize. So this is why I pre-framed this with our generational differences. If we can start talking the language of our children, then we're far more likely to have a two-way conversation. When I say the language of our children, it means that if, for example, in your house, you have an avid gamer, somebody who's really into online games, and you couldn't care less about online games, I'm afraid you have to start caring about online games. If you download one of these games and play it, and then ask your child about something that's going on in that game, you might be quite surprised at how they turn around and look at you and say, hey, what do you know about PUBG, Fortnite, Call of Duty? And that in itself is an opening for us to have communication with our children and talk the language of them so that we can have this conversation and bring some of the things that we are now knowledgeable about to their attention in a way that they can understand it rather than them just turning off and not listening to us. One of the things that we did a few years ago was an initiative, 1 hour for dinner. I know everybody's super busy and that life goes at 1,000 miles an hour, but if we can carve out 1 hour for dinner every day, whereby we sit around a table as a family, no devices, that includes us as mum and dad, no TVs even, and we sit down and we talk about our days, we talk about what's going on, and we make it a safe space for our children to talk about anything. No punishment, no judgment, just a safe space to share information. In the first instances of implementing this, it's going to be very quiet. Nobody's going to want to talk. The children aren't going to want to talk. But if we continue to do this, they start to talk about some of the small things that have been bothering during the day, both good and bad. And then they get comfortable with that kind of thing. They're far more likely to talk to us about some of the big things like bullying, like cyberbullying, when it comes to us as parents being the resource that they need us to be and that they will approach to talk to. The one thing that we really have to focus on as parents in this, and we have to get really good at, and it's the hardest thing to do, we have to listen and we have to be quiet and we have to let them just talk without trying to jump in and fix the problem or come up with suggestions. We just need them to talk to us and let them vent whatever it is there. So that's the second thing. Third thing, we can use the technology that's available to help us when it comes to monitoring what's going on with our children. Parental software, parental blocking software is really, really useful. It is a big part of how we can combat things like cyberbullying and our children doing things that they shouldn't do in the online space. But I also need you to be very aware that just by putting parental controls onto your home network, your Wi-Fi, or your children's mobile devices doesn't mean that you're done. Halas, finish. We're done. We're safe. It just gives us more information to help us be more effective parents. At the very bare minimum, what we want to do is we want to install things like family accounts. So whether you're an Apple user or you're an Android user household, both of them have this functionality available where you set up you as a mum or dad as the parent on the account. Your children's accounts come under there. That means when they want to download specific apps, when they want to do certain things, when they want to purchase things online, they have to come through you and get permission to do that. So this is the bare minimum that we can do to start to protect them from getting their hands on some of the apps that they shouldn't have when they're too young, or by accidentally rinsing your credit card because they were just purchasing currency in one of their games without you knowing about it. So setting up family accounts within your family unit is really, really important. A couple of other tools that we can be aware of. Spin Safe Browser. This is a piece of software that we can install on our children's devices. It is like Google, except it doesn't allow access to any of the negative stuff that they can access on Google. It's already been it's been built so that you can't access the inappropriate content. You don't have to turn on a filter to filter that out. It's just not there. So it's a really, really useful tool for schools and also for individual households. iKids is another software. It's a box that you plug onto your Wi-Fi at home, and then you can control exactly what they can and can't do on those Wi-Fis. And then I mentioned Bark because this is the pinnacle of software when it comes to parental controls. The only problem is it's not available here in the UAE. It's only supported in the US. But the reason I bring it to your attention is because this is their homepage. And what the software has helped them to do is protect 5.7 million children from things like cyberbullying and grooming and so forth. 280,000 severe self-harm situations have been detected using this software, and 2.1 million severe bullying situations have been detected using Bark as a software. As I say, it's there for reference for us. We can't utilize it, but on the ground here, we have an equivalent, and it's a software called Nishint. It's here in the UAE. It's supported here in the UAE. They have mobile device management for schools, and then they have parental control software for individual family units as well, where you can block pornography, block apps, block games, turn the internet off. You can monitor and block all of the social media channels that your children are utilizing. You can set up safe zones so that you can make sure that your house, you can only access certain things that you want them to have available. And you can also monitor calls, SMSs, and contacts in case they're getting unwanted messages across the board from strangers that's perhaps putting them in danger. So how do we as parents, caregivers, auntie, uncles work best as a team to support children in the digital world? The first thing we have to do is watch what we share and teach them about what they share. In the UAE, we live in a culturally diverse population, and we all have to consider what we're about to say or push into the digital space because of how it may impact others. It's the very definition of tolerance and diversity in terms of thinking about who else might see this and how it might impact them is a core lesson that we want to help our children understand. It leads to a more tolerant society because we're more constantly thinking and more cognizant about what we're putting out there. But it also can avoid some legal implications on the ground here in the UAE as well, where with saying things that are not true or sharing things that are not true can land you in real hot water. One of our core mantras at Beat the Cyberbully is stop, think, post. These three words I iterate when I speak with students about them thinking about this when they're online. When you're about to put something out there, stop for a second, think very clearly about what you're about to say, share, do. If it's going to be a positive impact, then post it. If it's going to be a negative impact, don't post it, because once it's out there, it's very difficult to take it back. And if it's negative bullying about somebody, even if you decide to delete it, that piece of content will take on a life of its own. And the person that you said it about will have to suffer the consequences for a long, long time. And that's not fair. And we need to be able to control that when we think about what we're doing. Generate positive content is our other mantra, where if we start to think like this, we can start to contribute to making the internet a safer and more positive space. Cyberbullying and bullying stems from usually ill thought out negative content, mean comments, inappropriate images, negative types of content. If we flip the narrative and start pushing more positive out there, we might start to see the instances of things like cyberbullying reducing. Things like grooming and cyber crimes reducing, because our children are more aware of what's going on and they're looking at it from a positive slant instead of the negative. The other thing that we can do is provide our children with structure, which may seem odd based on how much we use the technology, how much we're on our phones and on our iPads and so forth. But we need to provide them with structure, because even though they will rebel against it and say they don't want it, a lot of us will be familiar with this, that if we have a routine and structure when we have a baby, a lot of our babies actually, they warm to that. They understand that it's bedtime, it's feeding time, it's bedtime, it's nap time, it's time to do this. And that structure helps them to process what's going on. So we also want to provide that kind of structure to our children in the digital space. And one of the best ways of doing this as a family is to create what we call an acceptable use policy. And we do this together as a family. We create it together. We make sure that we are clear about what it is. We go through the process of going through some of the questions that are here on the screen, some of the subject matter that's covered on the screen here. And then we decide as a family how we are going to utilize the internet. We put our names down, we agree to how long we're going to do it for, and we sign it and we commit to it. And most importantly, whoever breaks the rules, whether it's mum or dad or the children, that the punishment is actually carried out, and that we as parents can also be subject to those punishments. So an acceptable use policy is a really good way of providing structure to our children. The next thing that we can do is we can really focus on positive examples of what's happened in the online space. Positive content regularly, think about certain things, and talk to them about how the slant and switching the field of vision to the positive changes and actually demonstrates tolerance and diversity. I've got some positive scenarios here. I'm very conscious of time, so I won't show this video, but I can make it available afterwards. And it's a video from the Digital Sisters in the UAE, in the UK. And it actually tells a story of 3 young people that have suffered with addiction to social media and so forth, and how they have then turned their lives around to actually make good use of the internet to really make a positive statement and make a positive change. And I'll make that available for communication through the organizers afterwards. I want to talk about this young lady as well, because this is a great example to share with our children. Kekeshan Basu was a student here in the UAE. At 12 years old, she experienced extreme cyberbullying, even death threats to her and her family because of the good work that she was doing online. But with the support of her family, she was able to overcome this and carry on the good work. She set up this company called Green Hope at 12 years old, and it's all around sustainable development, children's rights, environmental protection. And she's utilizing now the technology that was causing her the negative, the cyberbullying, to really leverage it and promote her business. Over the last few years, she's been talking on various stages with all sorts of representatives from countries, ex-prime ministers, the Earth Odyssey, all around sustainability, the ex-prime minister of Canada, ex-prime minister of Greece, she's shared the stage with, and she's now also been named as one of the top 30 under 30 when it comes to sustainability. So a great example of how somebody has gone through cyberbullying, how they have used and lent on their family to get through this, and are now using the very same technology to do amazing things on this planet, build the life that they want to build, and have overcome this negativity, and are now, again, pushing, especially with Kekeshan, from a diversity perspective, incorporating, making the world smaller from a positive perspective. And then my final example of positivity to share, a young man called Shan. He is also here, a student in the UAE, and he's an author. He's written a book. It's a published book. It's available to purchase on Amazon. He's 9, maybe 10 years old now. He wrote it with the help of his mum and dad. And the reason he wrote this book was because of all the negativity he saw in the online space, the cyberbullying, the segregation, the hatred, and the intolerance he saw was what caused him to write this book and write this story. And he wrote it so that it was about having a second chance to do the right thing. And it's a fabulous read, highly recommend it. And now he is also leveraging the same technology to get a wider audience. It's on Amazon. And for everybody that purchases it, a donation is then made to help with the education of 2 young boys that he met on holiday in Malawi. He's helping them with their education. He played football with them while he was on holiday. He's now written a book, and for every book that gets sold, he can make a contribution to their education in the country that they're from. It's a fantastically positive message in terms of utilizing the digital space for good rather than for bad. It's good ways to talk to our children about how we can refocus them, reframe their use of the online space, and how that if we decide to go down this route, we can actually start to live in a more tolerant society, both offline and online, and that if we start to focus more on the positive content, that we as a community, we as a country, we as a global society can actually start to make the online space a more positive one, a more inclusive one, a more diverse one, and a happier place to spend some time. I want to thank everybody who's on this call for coming on and for letting me share this information with you. I hope that you found this really helpful and interesting. And again, it's been my absolute pleasure and honor to be a part of this. Thank you so much for your time. Yasmin, did you want to jump in? You're on mute. Any questions? Are there any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat. Oh, you have a question. Okay. Hmm. Okay, so great question. A question from a teacher. How do we engage the parents if we feel a student is being bullied? It's a very good question. So in terms of if we as a teacher feel that maybe a student is being bullied, the first thing that we need to understand and try to find out before we engage the parents is whether or not that student actually is being bullied, either cyber or otherwise. Then we have to gather intelligence, if you like, or gather the evidence of what is being going on to be able to have a direct conversation with the parents. Now, this also is a two-sided thing, because if we feel that a student is being bullied, we have to be able to engage the parents of the victim in this with outreach. Either personal outreach is always better rather than email or phone call. If we can get the parents to come to the school so that we can have an open conversation about this, it's a very, very positive step from that side of things. We also have to take into consideration who we believe the bully is. And we also want to try and reach out to the parents of the bully if we know who that is. And again, from a personal perspective, we want to only do that when we have some evidence that there is something happening, because the last thing that we want to do is to get parents coming in or reaching out saying that we think this is happening, and then when we actually get to talk to them, the children say, oh no, there's nothing going on, it was just a joke or whatever. But we do need to understand from the student's perspective what's happening first of all, because this comes back to something that I mentioned in the session, is that we also have to listen to them. And in some cases, if that student is being bullied, but at this moment in time doesn't want to involve the family or the parents, we also have to respect that. And we have to be there as the teacher, as the caregiver, to be the resource, at least for the interim, until they are ready to talk to their parents and have them involved in this, because there's often some specific dynamics happening when bullying is going on. Bullying at the end of the day is a power shift. So for whatever reason, that person has decided to bully that young person, there's something going on at their end as well. And so we need to take both sides of that coin into consideration. Okay. Another question, what if my child is in denial and won't share with me? Is the only solution locking them offline? Okay. So if they are not sharing, depends what they're not sharing with you and what that actually means. If they're not sharing their passwords or their phone or what's going on in the online space, depending on how old your child is, this comes back to setting the boundaries for them. Is that depending on how old your child is, if you have purchased their phone and they are living under your roof, then from my perspective, it's your rules. And therefore, we have to set the rules in place to say, if you are going to live here and use the technology that I have purchased for you, i.e. borrow it, these are the rules that you will abide by. And that means sharing your passwords with me, letting me look at your devices at the end of the day, at the end of the week, just as a cursory glance. And if they decide to not adhere to these rules, then yes, taking the devices away is one way of trying to make that message clear. The problem with that, and the problem with then just locking them offline and banning them, is that they will spend 100% of their effort and time finding a way to go behind your back to get online. And they will enlist their friends will lend them their devices, they will log into their accounts using their devices, they'll buy a burner phone, they'll find any way to go around you. So the only solution to this is to be able to try and communicate how important it is for this dynamic to happen. And if you've been experiencing issues, then it's not going to be a simple fix. And again, I hold my hands up. I do not have a magic pill solution to this. The only thing that we can look to do is to try to speak and communicate with our children to help them understand why there are guidelines in place for them, and for them to understand that not adhering to those guidelines mean there are consequences, and those consequences may be limited access to their phone. I've seen a lot of the parent groups on Facebook and various other platforms that I'm members of. It's quite effective when you do take away their device, because they want nothing more than to have the device back. But when you take that away, you also have to monitor them very quickly as to how much effort they're putting into trying to go behind your back, behind your rules and behind your restrictions by using their friends. So there's no quick fix. We have to try and open the communication channels with our child. It's very difficult if you've already let them have free reign as such, and now you want to try and lock it down, because of course now our children are turning around saying, hey, that's not fair. I've been doing this for 3, 5, 10 years, and now suddenly you're telling me I can't do this. But that's the reality for them, is that yes, that is exactly what's going on. These are the reasons why this is happening. These are the reasons why I want you to share what is happening in your digital life with me, because as your parent, my job is to help guide you on your journey, and I cannot do that if you're not communicating with me. They will come back saying that's not fair, that's an invasion of privacy, I'm old enough, I know better, you don't know what you're talking about, all the usual stuff that our children will come back at with. And it's about consistently coming back with the same messaging and saying, look, these are the rules moving forwards, and we as a family are going to find a way to put together our acceptable use policy. We're not saying that you cannot use this, but there are going to be rules and guidelines of how you can use this, how often you can use it, what you can use it for, and then proceed from there. But everything comes back to opening those communication channels.
That's amazing. But it's true about the setting the boundaries. I finally could unmute. But my nephew, I know he's like, his mother kind of just let him have using his mobile phone, using the PlayStation, and it got to a point where he was kind of being bullied on over a video game. Like he was, I guess, talking to people on the video game, and he was kind of being bullied. And then she didn't know whether she should stop the game completely, but because there was never really the boundary, and then so like
it's difficult.
So you think it is, but you think at any cost you have to reset it, I guess, right?
You do, and if that is the case, you also introduce them gradually, rather than just being a full-on, this is how we're changing all the rules, is that we're going to say, right, well, we're going to reduce the amount of time that he can play on the Xbox, for example. Something that we're also going to introduce is that you can't have the chat function live on your Xbox. You can still play the games, but not having the chat function live. You're also not going to be wearing your headphones. You're going to have the speaker so I can hear what's going on. I know that can be very annoying for parents and aunties and uncles, but sometimes it's better to be able to hear what's being said, because if they're on a shared server, they might be 10 years old, they might be 5 years old, and there's other 15, 18, 25-year-olds on that same server. Some of the language that they use is adult language, because they are adults, they don't realize that there's young kids on there. So these are some of the things that we have to be aware of. And as you said, just to gradually introduce the rules for how we're going to move forwards, and openly communicate with them why it's happening is the most important thing.
Thank you so much for being here. Let me just check if we have any other questions. We will be sharing a survey with everybody after this session. So, I mean, if they come back with any questions, because I know that people that are on the 10X platform can't really correspond with us. So if we do have questions after this, we'll definitely email them to you, and we'll share the recording until after the event.
Absolutely, yeah. Sounds great. Yeah, and
again,
thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.